Thank you for being here today. So this work does come out of my current book project, which is centered around Benjamin Franklin. But when I began with the notion that Franklin could not have come up with this notion of virtuous labor and industrious independence and slow and steady striving and rising, and the creation of this culture, which really takes shape in the 19th century, this culture of American upward mobility. He couldn't have done that on his own. He couldn't have done it out of nothing. Where did it come from? So the project began by looking much earlier, and I was anticipating that I could wrap that story up fairly quickly and get to the 18th century. It didn't happen. So what I did find is that the 17th century tells a very fascinating prehistory of the 18th story that I mean ultimately to tell. And so my story's just gotten a little bit longer, but today I'm going to share with you some of the first half. So in our current Through the Glass Darkly presidential campaign, the greatness of America has remained a central and unusually inane question for one of the candidates. A related question about the status of upward mobility in America has been repeatedly asked by both people on the left and on the right. The current Republican platform, which emphasizes deregulation and tax cuts, is optimistically called Restoring the American Dream. And with very different ideas in mind, MoveOn.org insists that voters take back the American dream. But despite their differences, one thing both sides agree on is that rising in wealth and status beyond one's birth is an American idea, a homegrown promise rooted in our history and inherent in our way of life since the founding at Jamestown. It might come as a surprise, then, to learn that the vast majority of upwardly mobile English migrants to the Chesapeake and the West Indies in the 17th century were those who achieved their success by leveraging significant capital and connections, that most of those who lacked such resources failed to thrive at all, and that the success of the former often depended on the failure of the latter. Because the wealth acquisition of middling and elite migrants was aided by considerable economic and social resources, and their status promotion was qualified by geographical distance and provinciality, we might call such rising moderate mobility. Despite the promises of promoters and recruiters, however, the hundreds of thousands of those who came to America as servants very rarely experienced prosperity. Many suffered early mortality, dying shortly after their arrival. Some endured particularly long indentures or had them extended as punishment for crimes or other offenses. And others were forced to extend their indentures for years because they lacked the means to be independent. Although a small number of servants became freeholders, most who survived their service remained landless and poor. As Allison Gaines writes of those who arrived in 1635, the vast majority would have been better off staying in England. Now, we know relatively little about what early migrants to America believed about upward mobility. One reason for that is that although historians have done considerable work on the subject, most of it is regional in scope and demographic, that is, in focus, with little cross-regional synthesis and minimal attention to cultural or literary evidence. Another reason we know so little is that most migrants failed to record what they hoped for and how they viewed what they did or did not achieve. As in England, risen men and women of the 17th century were keen neither to memorialize their humble pasts nor even to understand their success as a form of rising, however much others might have understood it that way. In the Chesapeake and West Indies, the lack of printing presses and cultures of literate self-reflection compounds this archival problem. But we can examine the evidence we do have: promotional literature about colonization, histories of upwardly mobile migrant groups and individuals, including elites, smallholders, servants, and slaves, and contemporary literary representations of colonial strivers and risers. Today, I mean to do so with an eye toward understanding the promises of upward mobility made to migrants, the experiences of those for which we have records, and the views that migrants and non-migrants alike expressed about rising in wealth and status. I'll show that if the moderate mobility of merchant and gentry class migrants was common, servants and smallholders only rarely acquired significant estates. But I'll also explore the inverse relationship between limited lower class mobility and the elite tradition of satire that persistently exaggerated and ridiculed it, and reimagined Chesapeake and West Indian societies as beset by ambitious upstarts and corrupted by their vulgarity and ignorance. Finally, I'll consider how colonial mobility was informed in both material and conceptual ways by the brutality of race slavery and the anomalous prosperity of black freedmen. All of these aspects of upward mobility in England's chief plantations, its ideological incoherence, uneven distribution, satirical critique, and racialized significance, would eventually shape the socioeconomic assumptions of 18th century Americans, like Benjamin Franklin, and the more pervasive and normative culture of striving and rising that emerged in the US after the Revolution. But they also help us to correct mistaken notions in contemporary US politics about the inherent Americanness, ideological consistency, and historical continuity of upward mobility. In rejecting this view, I hope my research will allow us to more honestly consider the ways in which such discourse, despite its radical promise, continues to be conservative and disciplinary, limited in its address, and deeply invested in both white privilege and the exploitation of a white underclass. Okay. Even before the English plantations in America existed, their promoters promised a better life to migrants of all sorts. Late 16th century writers described an Edenic paradise of treasure, natural plenty, and effortless prosperity. From Peter Martyr's account of Ponce de Leon's Fountain of Youth in Florida, to Walter Raleigh's search for the wealth of El Dorado in Guyana, rumor and myth combined to excite readers' imaginations about the New World's cornucopia. By 1605, such ideas circulated so widely that the London play Eastward Ho! Could parody them by describing Virginia as teeming with gold and precious gems, blessed with delicious food and fair weather, and defined by inevitable upward social and economic mobility. According to 17th century promotional tracts, American settlements would also solve the growing problems of England's overpopulation and underemployment, provide cheap raw materials and new markets for English goods, spread the gospel to pagan Indians, and keep the nation strong in an increasingly competitive global race for military and commercial supremacy. The colonies would offer impressive returns to investors and for those younger sons, fallen gentry, and decayed merchants who were willing and financially able to emigrate, a chance to restore lost fortunes and status. But for what promotional writers often called the meaner sort, laborers, small farmers, petty tradesmen, vagrants, and convicts, the promise of the American colonies was much more ambiguous. Conscious of the need to recruit large numbers of servants, some tracts made explicit appeals to migrants of the lower classes, often by contrasting English dearth with America's perpetual plenty. Richard Eburn's 1624 Plain Pathway to Plantations speaks to the capacity and understanding of even the meanest, especially those in misery and distress, and suggests that such migrants in America will rise to great riches, wealth, and good estate. Likewise, I'm going to have to trust this at some point. Likewise, John Hammond's 1656 tract Leah and Rachel reports that in Virginia, some from being wool hoppers in England have there grown great merchants and attained to the most eminent advancements the country afforded. George Alsop's 1666 character of the province of Maryland declares axiomatically, "Dwell here, live plentifully, and be rich." At the heart of such arguments is a claim for free labor, an economic autonomy that allowed one to become what John Smith's 1616 description of New England calls master and owner of his own labor and land. In Old England, of course, land was scarce and expensive, and labor was cheap and highly regulated. But in America, the promoters insisted, work was remunerative because resources were naturally abundant, and free because unconstrained by the excessive interference of law or authority. So literary historians have often celebrated such proto-democratic rhetoric of autonomous labor and virtuous mobility as the origins of a specifically American discourse of economic freedom. But there are good reasons to doubt that most readers saw it this way. First, riches in early modern English culture were always relative. And in these tracts, The term implies a significant improvement in circumstances, but almost never a change in rank. Moreover, such texts reflect a deeply ingrained commitment to social hierarchy. They assume the inveterate vices of the poor, and they distinguish sharply between the opportunities that await different status groups. Sometimes very literally, they say the opportunities for laborers are here, and the opportunities for gentlemen are over here, and you shouldn't be confused by the difference. Indeed, claims about the prosperity of servants in America were invariably subordinate to schemes for ameliorating elite fortunes and alleviating English poverty and unemployment. Thus, John Donne's 1622 sermon before the Virginia Company promised that emigration to America shall sweep your streets and wash your doors from idle persons and children of idle persons and employ them. Despite his rhetoric of riches, Eburn, too, admits that, quote, the benefit of poor men's labors redounds for the most part not to themselves, but to the benefit of rich men here that have sent them thither, end quote. It was also widely believed that the chief benefit to the poor in America was less their economic than their moral improvement through the inculcation of prudential virtues, especially industry. In much the same way, for elite migrants, gain in America was often described as a renewal more than a rising, not a change in class or rank, but a reclaiming of what an unstable economy and changing times had taken away, or what Defoe in Moll Flanders called restoring our fortunes to the world, in the world. The contradictions inherent in a status-bound discourse of economic mobility, however, could often result in rhetoric that was simultaneously alluring and ominous. Smith, for example, understands the upward mobility of adventurers to be a powerful force in the imperial history of the New World. Its most famous explorers, he writes, were brave spirits that advanced themselves from poor soldiers to great captains, their posterity to great lords. But Smith also sees the correlation of global adventure and upward mobility as key to the history of the rise and fall of empires like that of Greece and Rome. Those by their pains and virtues became lords of the world. They by their ease and vices became slaves to their servants. If adventure made great men and empires then, it also led to a radical status reversal that brought them down as others ascended and took their place. Smith's dramatic rhetoric is undoubtedly meant to stir the imaginations of readers and inspire them to migrate to America. But it also contains within it a paradox and a threat. Those who migrate might themselves rise to greatness for the good of England, but the same colonial rising by members of the lower classes might also turn English society and its status system upside down. During the 17th century, over 170,000 people migrated to the English West Indies, compared with about 120,000 in the Chesapeake. But wealth acquisition in both regions occurred largely among a minority of economically well-off migrants. In the Chesapeake, it was the adventuring younger sons of aristocrats and gentry, as well as substantial merchants, tradesmen, and farmers, who eventually constituted a majority of successful planters and a relatively stable ruling class. Some of the region's richest 18th century families, the Birds, Carrolls, Carters, Fitzhughs, and Lees, were founded by these early migrants. In the West Indies, too, wealthy planters like the Codringtons, Draxes, and Motifords were mostly of merchant and gentry class origins. But the few private records we have suggest that if the settlement of such men in America increased their wealth and gave them a boost of personal dignity and social importance, the stigma of ambitious striving and enduring belief in the social superiority of the English gentry probably functioned to check any sense of their having risen too far beyond their original status. As Robert Beverley's 1705 History of Virginia asserts, such men came to that colony only to, quote, increase the estates they had before, end quote. Likewise, as risen Barbadian planters were promoted to knighthoods and baronetcies, apologists like John Oldmixon were moved to obscure their mobility and insist that the island could boast, quote, as many good families as are in any of the counties of England where commerce and trade flourish. In America, moderate mobility was hardly seen as mobility at all. The most radical form of mobility in both regions, from indentured servant to thriving planter, was, however, also the least common, despite the claims of colonial propaganda. The terms of servitude in the early Chesapeake varied widely, as did the promises made to servants upon their completion. Freedom dues ostensibly involved grants of land, tools, corn, clothing, but promises were often not the same as performance. Whatever freedmen received was typically inadequate to turn them into landowners. The additional cost of surveying, patenting, and cultivating land forced many into long-term tenancy. By the 1660s, a sizable majority of freedmen in Virginia and Maryland worked for their former masters as laborers or tenants, or left for opportunities elsewhere. In the West Indies, a similar pattern of limited servant mobility began 2 decades later, but other factors made rising there even more unlikely. As arable land became scarce and expensive, freedom dues were fatally diminished, and when planters gave up tobacco, cotton, and indigo for a highly profitable sugar monoculture in the 1640s, opportunities for servants virtually disappeared. Chattel slavery, uncommon in Virginia and Maryland until the 1660s, was significant in the West Indies from the very beginning, thereby rendering the cost of even the smallest plantation prohibitive for most freedmen. Such conditions combined to make the West Indies the most common American destination for migrants of all classes, the most profitable for elites, and the most hopeless for servants and smallholders. Despite the gloomy odds, early and brief windows of opportunity between 1620 and 1650 in Virginia, 1640 and 1670 in Maryland, and 1635 and 1660 in the West Indies. During this window saw a very small number of ex-servants acquire land, grow tobacco or sugar, purchase labor to harvest it, hold political office, and enjoy extraordinary success. Such men became not only some of the wealthiest planters in the colonies, but in some cases, their leaders. If they were an unprecedented elite of self-made men, however, their reign would be short, and most would not produce successful heirs or found traditional gentry families. Indeed, their uncoupling of political from social power fomented in the minds of elites a sense of veritable anarchy that stood in conspicuous contrast to the quieter mobility of affluent migrants and the creation of a stable ruling elite later in the century. We know relatively little about these ambitious risers. In most cases, only that they began as indentured servants or very modestly equipped smallholders, eventually held political offices, and died leaving sizable estates. In Virginia, Richard Townsend arrived in 1660, completed his service in 1620, completed his service in 1626, and a decade later had married the sister of a London gentleman and claimed a seat in the House of Burgesses. Migrants like John Ooty, Abraham Wood, Adam Thorogood, and William Spencer are first recorded. This is not working, is it? Okay, now I'm going to tell you that, I had all of these really very nice little script fonts to represent signatures here, and somehow the software is not taking it. So you can imagine, actually some of these fellows probably could not have signed their names, but I wanted to keep it interesting. So Ooty, Wood, Thorogood, and Spencer are first recorded as men of little means and later succeed in engrossing large tracts of land and dominating the council. In Maryland, Henry Adams arrived as a servant in 1638 and later served as Charles County judge and a member of the Assembly. 30 years after his servitude, Zachary Wade was one of the largest landowners in the colony with an estate valued at over £4,000. Although servant mobility in the Chesapeake had peaked at around 1660, after that time, Miles Gibson, Christopher Goodhand, and Philip Lynes served out their indentures, cultivated plantations, held numerous offices, and died men of significant wealth. In Barbados, likewise, Francis Dean arrived as a servant in 1635 and in 1659 sold his plantation for 15,000 pounds of sugar. And William Withington, a servant in the mid-1640s, owned property valued at 30,000 pounds of sugar by 1674. Okay. In St. Christopher, Fance Beecher, a very interesting character, arrived in 1639 as a penniless youth, quickly built a dry goods fortune, and eventually served on the council. And in Jamaica, a handful of struggling Barbadian smallholders and Cromwellian soldiers like Francis Price, Thomas Ayscough, and Whitgift Aylmer eventually became leading planters and politicians. Now, many of these radically risen men in the Chesapeake and West Indies leveraged two important forms of social capital on their path to success: advantageous marriage and political office holding. Because law and custom restricted women's roles in commerce, their own upward mobility occurred almost exclusively through marriage to a wealthy or upwardly mobile man. Some had their servitude curtailed when prospective husbands purchased their remaining time, and a few may have married into considerable wealth, as did the eponymous ex-servant in Afraben's 1689 play, The Widow Ranter. But for striving men of all ranks, marriages to similarly capable and determined women, especially women of means, were usually key to cultivating fortunes. Widows were an especially attractive option, since high mortality left numerous women wealthy and single, though few remained so for long. Thus, Ben's ranter quips of Virginia, quote, "Rich widows are the best commodity this country affords." Now, political office, however, may have been its second best commodity. To serve as a constable, a burgess, a judge, a militia officer, or a council member was both a sign and a source of wealth and status. It provided opportunities to collaborate with other elites, gain access to market information, control the distribution of land grants, and pursue both legal and illegal means of beating the competition. As Ben's play suggests, the political leadership of risen men subjected them to elite ridicule as bumptious upstarts, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But for most, it was nevertheless essential to achieving and maintaining economic power. So, my question is, and it's a difficult one given the evidence, how did these radically risen freedmen and their wives and families understand their own success? Again, the letters and diaries that might flesh out the skeletal evidence we have simply do not exist. But we can infer a good deal by exploring the rich rhetorical tradition of satirizing the radical upward mobility of American colonials, which begins with the settling of Jamestown. John Smith was the son of a Lincolnshire yeoman and a former merchant's apprentice who became a gentleman, a leader of the Virginia colony, and a prominent spokesman for colonial enterprise, which inspired the resentment of fellow Virginia Company member Edward Wingfield, who then alleged that Smith had once begged in Ireland like a rogue without a license. Likewise, George Yeardley, the ambitious son of a successful merchant tailor, secured a tobacco plantation, a gentry wife, and a knighthood before becoming governor of Virginia in 1618. But once in office, a petition to the council submitted by sundry ancient adventurers argued that Yeardley lacked sufficient personal authority and greatness to inspire willing submission without contempt or repining. Yeardley died in 1627, a wealthy man with an impressive record of achievement. But over a decade later, one Thomas Parks earned 30 lashes for slander after he called Yeardley's father but a tailor that leapt off a shopboard in Birchen Lane, and his mother but a midwife not to the honor citizens but to byblows, that is, bastards. Such a modest rise from the son of a yeoman or merchant to membership in the colonial gentry was not uncommon later in the century, but in the early decades in earlier decades, its scandal reveals how sensitive Chesapeake elites could be about the privileges of rank. The personal slights against Smith and Yeardley partake of a tradition of status-based ridicule that extends back well before Jeremy Barlow and William Roy called Cardinal Wolsey a vile butcher's son in 1528. Such rhetoric offers to unmask the risen man's claim to status not only by exposing his true origins, but by dramatically narrating them. In a colonial context, such language is energized by the mass mobilization of laborers and the uncommon but disconcerting success of a very small minority of them. Perhaps the best early example of this rhetoric comes from John Pori, cousin to Yeardley's wife and Virginia Colony Secretary, whose 1619 letter to Dudley Carleton boasted of Virginia's improving health and abundant resources and sketched a humorous example of its prosperity. "Now that your lordship may know that we are not the veriest beggars in the world, our cowkeeper here of James City on Sundays goes accoutred all in fresh flaming silk, and a wife of one that in England had professed the black art not of a scholar, but of a collier of Croydon, wear her rough beaver hat with a fair pearl hatband and a silken suit thereto correspondent. The aim of this description is divided between an earnest desire to demonstrate the thriving state of affairs in Virginia in sharp contrast to its early catastrophes, and a parody of the sumptuary excesses such thriving has yielded. The silk-clad commoners indicate a surplus of tobacco profits and a lucrative colonial system of exchange, but they also trade in familiar stereotypes of class posturing. The apparent success of the dandified husbandman enables a flamboyant sartorial distance from the muck and grime of his profitable vocation. If we assume that the former Croydon collier has become a prosperous tobacco farmer, his finely accessorized wife haughtily discovers in his more lucrative employment a promotion in social rank. Thus, as Pori seeks to counterclaims that colonials in America are beggars, he rejects one negative stereotype for another that would persist alongside it throughout the century and beyond, that some colonials were suspect figures of radical upward mobility, flush with new money, and desirous of manifesting their riches publicly, but incompetent in the refinements of genteel life. This satirical rhetoric of radical rising appeared repeatedly in early literary accounts of the Chesapeake and West Indies. Such language burlesques the wealth acquisition and status promotion of thriving lower-class migrants by rendering their success as sudden, undeserved, ephemeral, and merely performative. It thereby not only hyperbolizes the anomaly of such success, but elides the mental and physical costs of migration, the considerable risks to life and fortune, and the hardships of servitude and plantation. But it also measures the risen Virginian's unsteady social performance against the canons of taste and refinement that were its chief premise, what Northrop Frye calls the implicit moral standard upon which satire depends. And it thus recasts the pleasures of autonomy and pride of accomplishment as ignorant, superficial, and fatuous. Among the richest sources of such rhetoric is Ben's play, which centers on the 1676 rebellion in Virginia led by Nathaniel Bacon. The immediate cause of Bacon's rebellion was the recognition among servants and landless freedmen that the elites who ran the council and House of Burgesses were using taxes and per diems and dubious public investments to augment their wealth. It was the brash, well-born Bacon who catalyzed such frustrations and channeled them toward ongoing conflicts with the Susquehanna natives. But for Bacon, the underlying problem was the domination of the colony's power structure by prosperous former servants and other wealthy men of questionable origins. After Governor Berkeley accused him of treason, Bacon issued a manifesto, which, like the petition against Yeardley, deplored the upward mobility of the colony's leaders. Let us observe the sudden rise of their estates compared with the quality in which they first entered the country, and let us see whether their extractions and education have not been vile. So by the 1660s, Virginia's risen freedmen, men like Townsend and Ooty and Wood and Spencer, raised the ire of those who continued to see status as the primary qualification for public office. And Bacon deemed such men, quote, unworthy and base fellows of no trust or faith. The outcome of the rebellion, the plundering of estates, the burning of Jamestown, the massacre of Indians, and the death of Bacon by dysentery is well known. What is less often observed is that it was an elite revolt against the upward mobility of low-status planters as much as an uprising of the propertyless against the propertied. Paradoxically, Bacon defied a government of risen men by leading a cohort of tenants, servants, free blacks, and slaves who wanted to rise themselves. From his perspective, then, the rebellion was a conflict between a colonial government that had come to depend on an open elite and a traditional elite that wanted to assert its prerogative to lead. The widow ranter satirizes Virginia's contradictory politics of status in the 1670s by developing the rhetoric of radical rising into a complex vision of colonial identity, though I only have time today to give you just a little taste of it. When Hazard, a spendthrift second son of gentry origins, comes to Jamestown to seek his fortune, he is introduced to a carnivalesque world of mobility, bearing witness to the sudden reversals of wealth and status that Smith linked to empire generally. The council consists largely of transported criminals who have, quote, acquired great estates, who having acquired great estates are now become your honor and right worshipful and possess all places of authority. For example, Dullman, a militia captain, is revealed to have once been a Newgate thief, and Boozer, a justice of the peace, was previously a common pickpocket. Timorous, another justice, is identified as a broken excise man and former indentured servant, and Dunce, the local parson, a failed farrier who counterfeited a deputation from the bishop and came over here a substantial Orthodox. Such radically risen men revel in their new status, unapologetically indulging in rum punch and self-regard, while lording it over everyone else, Hazard included, with their vulgar pomposity. But women too have rapidly transformed themselves and improved their rank in Virginia. Flirt, a barmaid, began life as a tailor's daughter, but now claims her father was a royal baronet, undone in the late rebellion. The widow ranter herself was, as we have seen, a servant bought from the ship, who married her master, acceded to his fortune of £50,000 within a year, and became the social leader of the colony. Indeed, women have enjoyed such promotions of status that all are madams, and it is, quote, the greatest affront imaginable to call a woman mistress, though but a retail brandymonger. Such deceitfully assumed identities ridicule the presumptions of Virginia's radically risen elite. The incompetent officers and cowardly justices mock both the remarkable success of a small number of prosperous freedmen and the colonial necessity of appointing non-gentry men to positions of authority. Like Porry's cowkeeper and former collier's wife, Ben's caricatures of extreme self-transformation wink at the promises of promotional tracts, obscure the prodigious labor and improbable luck of risen migrants, and realize such status mobility as trivial performance. It was perhaps the threat of ridicule that kept most upwardly mobile strivers, whether of elite or humble origins, from telling their stories of success, or even allowing them to be told by others. When the most famous risen man in the West Indies, the pirate, Navy Admiral, and Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, Henry Morgan, was accused in Alexander Exkemmeling's 1684 book, Buccaneers of America, of having been transported to Barbados as a servant, he sued the book's London publisher for libel and was awarded £200 and a retraction that assured readers he was a gentleman's son of good quality, never was a servant to anybody in his life, and that he rose to fame and fortune by his valor alone. Such a public imputation of former servitude, perhaps as much or more than the book's accusations of barbarism and illicit gain, undoubtedly galled the man who, by 1684, had purchased a sugar plantation, earned a knighthood, served in office, and sought the respect of local gentry, who may have understood base servitude as far worse a sin than remunerative cruelty. But wealth gained in the Sugar Islands was a particularly easy satirical target. Ned Ward, who traveled to Jamaica in 1687 and recounted his visit in the 1698 travel narrative, A Trip to Jamaica, called the island the receptacle of vagabonds, the sanctuary of bankrupts, and a close stool for the purges of our prisons. The West Indies was, he claimed, suffering under a social order in which traditional elites were absent and status was dangerously fungible. As with many migrants of the merchant class, it was, quote, the declination of trade and the scarcity of money in England, end quote, that caused Ward and his fellow travelers to come to Jamaica to, quote, patch up their decayed fortunes. Nevertheless, it's the purported radical mobility of the island's current residents that most energizes his satire. Echoing the histories of Ben's venal Jamestown grandees, he quips that a broken apothecary will make there a topping physician, a barber's prentice a good surgeon, a bailiff's follower a passable lawyer, and an English knave a very honest fellow. And like the countless madams of Virginia, men in Jamaica are all colonels, majors, captains, lieutenants, and ensigns. In a similar vein, Henry Whistler, who served during the conquest of Jamaica with Major Robert Venables, wrote in his journal that in Barbados, a rogue in England will hardly make a cheater or treasury officer. A bawd brought over puts on a demure comportment. A whore, if handsome, makes a wife for some rich planter. In fact, such language of precipitate status promotion and counterfeited honor was sometimes used to stigmatize whole West Indian colonies, as in a satirical poem criticizing the failed Scots settlement of Darien in Panama during the 1690s, which figured its collectivized national subject as a peddler turned merchant, or a sorry poor nation that was resolved to set up for a people of worth and had an itch to be great. So this language of radical status reversal stands in telling contrast to the plainly limited history of mobility in the English colonies generally. But its conservative ideological function is no doubt similar to that of the cultural resources from which it derives, such as the contemporary stage figures of the upstart gallant and the rustic clown. Formally, it often reflects the language of early modern employment instability, as in Roger Lestrange's translation of Aesop's fable, A Shepherd Turned Merchant, or Thomas Brown's complaint that anyone may set up for a doctor or pretend to prescribe remedies. But we also hear it in accounts of economic instability and status inconsistency in general, as in, again, John Smith's account of the ancient reversal of those who became lords of the world and those who became servants to their slaves, or even a century later in the wake of the South Sea bubble, Andrew Bradford's lament that by the same turn of fortune's wheel, footmen and cookmaids loll in their gilded chariots and smile at the fate of their quondam masters. Or indeed, in an oft-quoted line from Ecclesiastes, I have seen slaves riding on horses and princes walking like slaves on the land. Finally, this rhetoric partakes of an early modern trope that was born in 16th century Italy but popularized in the anti-leveler discourse of Civil War England, that of the world turned upside down. Such rhetorics of protest are, like much satire, characterized by what Alvin Kernan calls disorderly profusion, and claims to discover amidst such profusion the truth about mankind. But in fact, as the rhetoric of radical rising turns our attention away from the moderate mobility of elite migrants, it invests the most unlikely winners in the plantation economy with undeserved moral opprobrium, while inventing a history of status confusion that never quite happened. Of course, it also reveals the intense biases and prejudices ambitious lower-class migrants faced above and beyond their bleak odds of success. But it says even more about its creators, not only how they perceived colonial life and English culture, but also how they understood the elite mobility that did occur in America. Such sudden, almost magical reversals of rank denote the precarious of economic endeavor in the 17th century, and the speed at which anyone's status might change, for better or for worse. Its language of falsified honor perhaps betrays the fear that honor itself has become a form of falseness, and a set of values so unstable they need to be buttressed by an elaborate regime of social forms. Notably, Ward, Whistler, Morgan, Bacon, Pori, and possibly Ben were all colonials themselves, educated in the hardships and risks of migration, and well aware both of the small likelihood of wealth acquisition and status mobility among servants, and of the tendency of gentry and merchant class migrants to monopolize land and profits. But as striving travelers in the precarious American plantations, they were invested in defending the status system and in their own ways thriving in an economy that was productive of, and indeed founded on, elite mobility. Perhaps as suggested by William Holland's early 19th century prints lampooning the upwardly mobile planters of the West Indies, their satirical rhetoric served to register their ideological opposition to status mobility, while creating images of pretension so outlandish and offensive that colonial elites of middling origins, clinging to their own hard-won status and eager to defend its boundaries, would have failed to see themselves in them. The rhetoric of radical rising, that is, may have served as a screen for both the exploitation of lower status migrants and for the moderate mobility of higher status ones. So not every migrant who survived famine, disease, and servitude sought wealth and status in the Chesapeake and West Indies. Those who went to live, as John Smith put it, idle among the savages, appear to have either rejected the logic of labor and mobility or simply found in the Virginia Company's promises of only deception and misery and eventually gave up. Either way, if caught, they were punished with extreme brutality precisely because they stood as an affront to the ideological underpinnings of English settlement, as well as the private needs of planters. Indians, too, shaped the American history of mobility, both directly and indirectly, as strategic partners in trade, victims of land dispossession, and sources of enslaved labor. Above all, it was the enticement of Indian land, perceived to be free or cheap and ripe for cultivation, that drew English migrants to America. In some ways, perhaps, their economic beliefs were similar. Indians developed extensive trade and political networks. They assumed the spiritual and social power of luxury goods, and they sustained an elaborate, often hereditary status hierarchy. But in other ways, the Indian nations had very different ideas about what constituted property. And their custodial, use-based approach to land rights offered both an alternative to the English world of drudgery and competition and an implicit critique of colonialism's violent scramble for profits. It was enslaved and free blacks, however, who had the more significant and enduring impact on cultures of striving and rising in British America. Now, thus far, I have more or less held in abeyance the obvious but foundational fact that such enterprises ultimately came to produce vast amounts of wealth only because their demand for labor was met not by white servants, whose numbers diminished along with the perception of opportunity, but by the mass importation of African slaves, which began in the 1640s in the West Indies and in the 1680s in the Chesapeake. Slavery was not merely coextensive with upward mobility, but was in many ways an effect of it, of the growing pursuit of wealth acquisition and status promotion. As investors and colonists sought improved states in America, they increasingly depended on the labor of Africans to facilitate and expedite their success. Indeed, in both the Chesapeake and the West Indies, the development of elaborate slavery economies roughly tracks with the development of established planter elites made up largely of middling and gentry class migrants. As Ira Berlin aptly writes, if slavery made race, its larger purpose was to make class. Had American plantations been limited only to the elite members of the early colonizing companies, the demand for cheap labor might well have been satisfied by those white indentured servants willing to sell their time for a chance, however small, at a better life. But by mid-century, the entry of many more profit-hungry merchant and gentry class migrants into the tobacco and sugar markets increased that demand well beyond what such servants would meet given the conditions and prospects. As black slavery facilitated white upward mobility, however, it also confounded the ideological correlation of hard work and success on which the striving of migrants often depended. For slaves themselves, it made prudential virtue less relevant. After a 1691 Virginia law restricted the manumission of slaves, it removed most incentives to industry except the avoidance of pain or death. But for whites, too, it altered the moral economy of labor. In 1736, William Byrd of Virginia complained about the detrimental effect of slavery on the virtue of whites. I am sensible of many bad consequences of multiplying these Ethiopians among us. They blow up the pride and ruin the industry of our white people, who, seeing a rank of poor creatures below them, detest work for fear it should make them look like slaves. The claim that slave owning compromised the virtue of whites would find more frequent articulation in the 19th century. In the 17th and 18th centuries, however, it spoke more directly to the still inchoate idea of industry as a virtue and labor as a universal good. Thus, if Byrd exaggerates slavery's moral effect on whites, he crystallizes its effect on the status system and colonial mobility. For slavery not only undercut the value of labor, but it also distorted social perceptions of rank and disabled the moral logic behind the very culture of striving and rising it enabled. The act of psychological compensation at the heart of Byrd's observation, the white migrants' haughty disidentification with black slaves, despite the fundamental similarity of their laborious lives, dramatizes Edmund Morgan's influential thesis that class tensions between poor whites and planter elites were effectively quelled through the cultivation of racial prejudice. Before mid-century, whether or not they had a clear sense of how their status differed, and historians definitely disagree on this, black and white laborers often worked side by side, and a few, perhaps convinced they were fellow sufferers in an unfair system of exploitation, even ran away together. According to Morgan, white attitudes about blacks grew increasingly racist after the 1660s, largely as a result of the growth of the black population and the advent of slave laws that codified racial difference and rationalized the brutal treatment of black laborers. Thereafter, poor whites living among slaves may indeed have felt a tenuous sense of status promotion, disdain for their black social inferiors, and sympathy with their white social superiors. But such attitudes may also have been shaped by the fact that most white migrants failed to become freeholders. It was only when the recruitment of servants from England became increasingly difficult and the rampant corruption and abuse suffered by white servants and freedmen rendered them increasingly dangerous that planters began to turn to black slaves, whose importation enabled them to maximize profits without risking organized political resistance. The expansion of slavery thus confirmed not only the ruthlessness of large planters, but also the false promises of servant migration. In fact, it's conceivable that had white servitude more consistently led to land ownership, the supply of willing and able servants from England might have remained steady enough to meet the demand, leaving the importation of slaves an alternative too costly or distasteful to entertain. But because this was not the case, the growing presence of slaves was not only an argument for a collective white identity, but also a symbol of the unlikelihood of white servant mobility. Regardless of whether black slaves inspired in whites a sense of superiority or insecurity, or both simultaneously, however, they were themselves often figures of coerced perennial non-mobility. Undoubtedly, some had greater status than others. Mulattoes and those with special skills often commanded preferential treatment. Some slaves earned money, owned property, and even managed to purchase their freedom. And as Sidney Mintz has suggested, they may have sought to define their personhood through the possession of material wealth. Still, for blacks and whites alike, slavery usually meant the opposite of self-advancement. It haunted American cultures of striving and rising by standing as a definitive negation of liberty, ambition, and virtuous labor. For English migrants to the Chesapeake and West Indies, the vast majority of whom failed to rise, slavery certainly may have served as a consoling sign that their lives, however bleak and inert, could have been a whole lot worse. But it also may have represented to both blacks and whites the unmitigated and eternal impossibility of rising, offering in images of violent degradation and stooped resignation a disheartening reminder that accidents of birth or fate all too often overshadowed the claims of talent and determination. There were fewer free blacks in the West Indies, and because land was scarce and sugar works expensive, far fewer black freeholders. In some cases, however, slaves in the Chesapeake strove and rose beyond their bondage to acquire relative wealth and status, typically by trading in the produce of the small plots allowed them by their masters, purchasing their freedom, and cultivating farms of their own. The lives of such ambitious black freeholders as Francis Payne, Emmanuel Driggis, Jane Gossel, and William Harmon are profiles in courage, shrewdness, and tenacity. The best known example of such upward mobility is that of Anthony Johnson, an Angolan who arrived in Virginia in 1621 as a slave named Antonio. He cultivated tobacco on a plantation south of the James River, and unlike many of his fellow slaves, survived the Powhatan Uprising of 1622. Later, he married Mary, a fellow slave who bore him 4 children and helped him thrive for over 40 years. During that time, he purchased his and his family's freedom, took the name Johnson, and with Mary's help, earned a local reputation for, quote, hard labor and known service. By the 1640s, the Johnsons were profitably raising cattle, hogs, and tobacco, and in 1651, they purchased land on the eastern shore. In the 1660s, the family left for Maryland, where it ultimately established a patriarchal lineage of free black planters that continued for at least 2 more generations. At which point, racial laws drastically constrained the prospects of free blacks, and the Johnsons disappeared from the historical record. We know enough about Anthony Johnson's life and legal struggles with neighboring planters to infer that black freedmen, economically successful or not, offered a particular provocation to whites, especially to poorer ones in a colonial economy in which few servants became masters. Those black freedmen who came to own substantial property signaled a measure of extraordinary success under extraordinary conditions. But their prosperity galled some whites and inspired the perfidy and corruption of those seeking to profit from their ambiguous status. By the 18th century, when black strivers like Olaudah Equiano and Venture Smith earned freedom and acquired property, they consistently faced the treachery of indignant and greedy whites. Resentment against the economic rising of free blacks was perhaps most vividly expressed in Edward Clay's early 19th century print series, Life in Philadelphia, which draws on the same satirical critique of vulgarity and presumption once aimed at risen white servants. Such satires implicitly argued that if a black man could raise himself from the lowest status of all to relative affluence and reputation, he was an unsettling reminder to whites that in the Atlantic world, talent and determination sometimes could transcend birth and fate, and that those whose striving had not yet led to rising might need to try harder. Thus, black mobility and immobility profoundly shaped the world in which early Americans strove and rose. Black labor, free and enslaved, not only fueled the robust 18th century and antebellum economies, it also registered greater and more widespread expectations for wealth acquisition and status promotion. That is, enslaved black bodies symbolized both the deprivation of economic rights and the prospect of great riches. Black freedmen marked the humblest kind of free labor, and for satirists and other critics, the most dangerous or comical kind of ambition. Black risers provided an evocative language for white writers like Franklin to dramatize the complicated dynamics of class and status. Their mobility gave a subversive charge to the prosaic claims of prudential virtue and a sharpened edge to the social critique of upstarts. For it offered both a refutation of the idea of black inferiority and a pointed example of rising's radical social disruptiveness. Although early black strivers and risers represent a smaller number of protagonists, historical and fictional, they had an outsized impact on the story of American upward mobility. That impact may never be more apparent than it is in our own historical moment, when the upward mobility of the nation's first black president stirs the malignant passions of those white voters who have turned to the vulgar and narcissistic billionaire scion of a New York real estate magnate mogul claiming to be a champion of the people and of their right to rise. But the fact that the same Donald Trump supporters scorn his opponent Hillary Clinton, a striver of middle-class origins, as an ambitious enemy of their own mobility is a measure of just how convoluted the rhetoric of mobility can be. The history of striving and rising helps us to see that many of Trump's supporters may have something in common with the 17th century servants and freedmen who were exploited, constrained, and race-baited by colonial elites. The dreams of mobility first articulated in early promotional tracts certainly remain alive and well in Trump's grandiose promises of economic redemption. But even more surprising is that Pori's and Ben's cartoonish colonial risers find contemporary expression in Trump's own performance of garish ostentation. Each renders economic excess as conspicuous and risible, but also aggressively unapologetic. Trump's crass extravagance thus succeeds in part by reappropriating satires of mobility and rejecting the canons of taste and refinement that are their chief premise. In fact, it makes a virtue of caricature by discovering the satirical truth not of status inconsistency or moral confusion, but of liberalism's illusions and exclusions. Trump's ostensible advocacy on behalf of resentful whites thus redeploys the profuse and chaotic rhetoric of radical rising in a perverse rejoinder to the logic of elite ridicule that helped to keep such people in their places for centuries. It transforms the satire of new money into the celebration of it, even as it offers false hope to those whose immobility has long been a condition of elite prosperity. Tocqueville's claim that in the US, at any moment a servant may become a master remains a potent promise, especially to the economically disenfranchised. But whether it's celebrated or mourned, the American dream of upward mobility is a discourse that obscures and distorts the realities of socioeconomic competition, and always has. Its first instances in the early Chesapeake and West Indies were nothing short of fraud. Despite the United States' democratic reorganization of power and wealth, the same was largely true of the go-aheadism of the early 19th century, the cult of the self-made man in the Gilded Age, and even the wide-eyed veneration of dot-com and hedge fund wealth in the early 21st century. For then, as now, the myth of upward mobility thrives on the moralization of greed, the lionization of success, and the shrouding of real economic power behind the dazzling veil of opportunity for everyone. Even when motivated by the most egalitarian of intentions, it taints legitimate aspiration with nationalism and acquisitiveness, conflates virtue with prosperity, distorts the values of independence and liberty, and obscures those of equity and collectivity. And it will no doubt continue to do these things for as long as we, even we who strive and rise in the relatively modest fields of academia, continue to believe in its ever-alluring promises. Thanks very much.